All right. Well, while we're waiting for some people to hop into the Zoom here, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Madison Hilly, and I am a partner at Radiant Energy Group. We are a small energy consultancy that primarily works on solving collective action problems in nuclear. Joining me today are my colleagues, Mark Nelson, the founder and managing director of Radiant Energy Group, and then Richard Allington, who will be the star of the show today. His big project is the global public attitudes towards clean energy polling. And this year's report, last year's data, is the biggest and perhaps the most interesting yet. So Anthropocene was very generous in inviting us back to break down those results and show you some of the key findings and the most interesting tidbits from that report. So, Rich, I will toss it over to you.
And our thanks also go to Anthropocene for helping fund the survey in the Southeast Asian countries, where we've seen some exciting data. So, bit of while we wait for the others to join, a bit of background to the PACE report, which I have here. So this year, there's 31 countries that we've surveyed. As in the past, there's 1,000 respondents per country. And what 1,000 respondents mean is you can be fairly confident of the results that you see presented to plus or minus 3%. So if it says that 60% support nuclear, well, you can be pretty certain that it's going to be somewhere between 57 and 63%. That's the sort of confidence level that you get with polling 1,000 respondents. Those respondents are representative of each country by age, by gender, by different regions within that country. The respondents are all aged 18 and over, and they are polled online through web portals, which is industry norm nowadays. Back when we were all young, there was more phone-based polling, but as you can imagine, that's quite expensive use of people's time. So the polling industry has transitioned now towards web-based polling, and that's how our 31,000 respondents have answered their questions. In total, I think there's 60 or so questions that we asked throughout the survey, and those questions span nuclear, but also other clean energy options. We look at wind, solar, biomass, and gas with carbon capture and storage, and that gives us this ability to benchmark nuclear's performance versus these other clean energy options, as well as benchmark nuclear's performance in one country versus other countries. And that way we have best practice that gets learnt. And the other thing I'd say, which routinely say, so apologies if you've heard the joke before, but we like to think of our polling as a small modular research, in that it's the same set of questions, copy and pasted year after year, country after country. And the benefit that you get there is slight economies of scale on the price, but much more improvement on the quality of the analysis, which I hope will come through in this presentation. So I'll now share screen to show you our results. Great, so you should see here a map of the world of all 31 countries where we polled. This map and all the other charts that I'll be showing are live on our website, and they're interactive. So we do invite you to go to our website. I believe a link will be shared in the description, and find out the data for yourself. So if we hover our mouse over the US, you see that in the US, we've got 36% support, 27% opposed nuclear, with net support that's fairly mid-table compared to the other countries. Overall, there's 22 of these of the 31 countries that we surveyed where support exceeded opposition. We dig in deeper into the data. Here you see all those 31 countries and what their numbers are, with totals at the bottom for G7, BRICS, and the global average. The global average is weighted by the population of all the different countries. So it's super helpful that we have China, India, near the top of our poll, really hard-hitting countries with 1 billion people each, lifting up that global average support. Also interesting to see BRICS countries higher levels of support than in the G7 for nuclear. And what we find this year, as well as last year, is that generally amongst these BRICS and developing countries, there's higher levels of support for nuclear, but also wind, solar, and other clean energy options that we've surveyed. You could come up with the idea that maybe they're more pro-growth, pro anything that will get them out of energy poverty and potentially financial too. If we dig in deeper into this data, a few numbers jump out. In China, we see strong support of 24% versus strong opposition of just 3%. And that's massive. There's 8 times more people that you can imagine shouting on the internet, on the streets in favor of nuclear than against nuclear. If we look at another country, in Ukraine, there's 25% strong support and very small, strong opposition. And that's really interesting from a country that has had the downsides of Chernobyl and invasion of its Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Yeah, this country still has high levels of support. There's a lot of lived experience that they've had, which others won't have had, and it's an interesting story there. Moving on, taking a look at how public opinion has changed this year versus last. On this line here, we see what 2024 net support is. And then the previous line, 2023. What we see is generally across all our countries, but especially the G7 countries highlighted here, net support for wind, solar, nuclear has declined. And that's interesting. As we distance ourselves from the energy crisis, it appears that people are becoming more discerning in what energy options they support and which they oppose. There might be less of a all of the above approach to supporting energy.
Rich, did
Yeah.
any of the countries surveyed see an increase or an uptick in support, particularly for nuclear?
So if we look through here, I think Spain was the one where we saw an increase, where support went from 31% in 2023 to 32% in 2024. But actually, if you look at opposition, Spain opposition dropped relatively large amount from 47% opposition to 42% opposition. So actually, Spain was the only country we saw where net support improved year on year. All the other countries' net support dropped. Where does that drop come from? So we see a drop in support. Opposition hasn't necessarily gone up in all these countries. Actually, there's quite a few countries where we see a downward slope for nuclear here on the right. Where those previous supporters have gone to is more of a neutral position. These are people who neither support nor oppose or don't know about their views on nuclear. So as we distance ourselves from the energy crisis, people are becoming less supportive and more neutral on their attitudes to nuclear. Great. Another finding we found, deep diving just into Europe, is that support for nuclear energy appears to be higher the closer a country is to Moscow or to Russia. And this is a really interesting graph because I first saw this graph not in an energy context, but in The Economist. They had a chart on share of GDP spent on military. And the same thing was seen there. You had Poland, Ukraine, Finland, Sweden spending a lot higher levels of their GDP on defense than countries further out from Moscow, like Spain. And that sort of defense security mindset carries through to maybe this energy security mindset, where the closer you are to Russia, the more concerned you are about invasion, the more concerned you are about energy as a weapon of warfare, having your gas cut off, for example, and support is much higher the closer you are to Russia.
Do you think it's possible? I know our polling wouldn't show why this is, but that countries that are in close proximity to Russia there's something cultural there, like they share a similar cultural disposition to be in favor of or not afraid of nuclear. Could that be something operating in the background here?
There's going to be a bit of that in that if I was to plot what Russia was on this graph, actually Russian support is very high, similar levels to Ukraine, Finland, Poland. Um, And there's a few Russians that sort of cultural view will spread out. But there is one question we ask in the survey, which is, of all the different energy attributes, what do you care about most? And concern for energy security was highest amongst these countries closer to Russia, but also was significantly higher amongst these countries than it was in Russia. And that tells me that this is something different to just cultural similarities with Russia, is that these countries do actually care a lot more for their energy security, and that's leading them to support nuclear more.
Got it. And then does this dynamic hold true for both men and women? Are we seeing men and women showing higher levels of support correlated with their proximity to Russia, or does that split?
So interestingly not. I don't have the chart to hand here, but we see this correlation is stronger and steeper amongst men, whereas amongst women, there doesn't seem to be that same drive for support. These potential energy security concerns aren't higher the closer you are to Russia amongst women. So yeah, it seems to be more of a male phenomenon, what we see in this chart.
Interesting.
If we move on, as with last year, we asked the question, of these 5 clean energy options, which ones do you think your country should focus on in its energy transition? So this is sort of a question of preference, or it's a question of which do you think has been undervalued the past years, and that should be put to the forefront in the coming years. And what's interesting here, over in the majority of countries, nuclear comes second to solar, but significantly ahead of the preference for wind, gas or carbon capture, or biomass. So there's a part of every country which has this 20+% preference for nuclear. And that's a strong vocal minority, which is in nuclear's favor. We also ask a separate question. So there's 3 questions in total, which are there to gauge overall feeling. There's that support question, preference, and then this is the more policy-oriented question. On the right, we have those who want to keep using nuclear, if they have it, and subsidize new builds. And here we see in Poland and in Russia, there's about half of people that want to subsidize new nuclear construction. Then in the lighter yellow is those that want to keep using, build more nuclear power plants, but not necessarily have it subsidized, have more private parties involved in building it. And then on the far right, we have a share that want to see nuclear just completely phased out and banned. And it's interesting, even in the most anti-nuclear country, right at the bottom, Thailand, there's, we have 43% who want to see it banned and nothing new being built. But those that want to see new nuclear being built isn't significantly lower than that. So overall, in the majority of countries, more people want to see nuclear being built than banned. Finally, going back to that support question, if we look just in Europe and just amongst those who say that they are not concerned about climate change, of those that are not concerned about climate change, net support is highest for nuclear than it is for other clean energy options. So to give you an example, in Sweden, it's maybe 10–20% of people are not concerned about climate change. And of those, there's 57% support, net support for nuclear, about half that for large-scale solar. And for these other clean energy options, there's very little net support. And why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because as we've seen recently, political cycles come and go. 2050 net zero goals are a long way away. There'll be many more political cycles to come in most democratic countries. And there's always this chance that a politician comes along who says that they want to cut everything that helps get them to net zero. And as we see in the US, for example, there's a lot more cutting of wind and solar support, government support, than there is for nuclear. And there's this argument that could be made that nuclear is this insurance option against net zero backlash. That in a world where there's a potential chance that a politician is going to come in and put a block on net zero progress, actually nuclear is your one energy option that's going to be able to push through and still get built and still help reduce emissions. So
Yeah.
there's almost a I think the term I put to it was where was it? I can't remember the term. Oh yeah, a cold alliance beats a hot defeat. A cold alliance being that those that are most climate concerned actually feel quite cold about nuclear. They don't like it that much. But it's better to have that cold alliance than the hot defeat of global warming.
Yeah, I think that it would be interesting to see how the most concerned about climate would react to that sort of argument, because at least in the US as well, nuclear is emerging as one of the very few bipartisan issues that get support on both sides of the aisle. So if someone is really concerned about climate change and wants projects that can last through these cycles, arguing that nuclear could
Hmm.
cross the finish line, it would be interesting to see how they react to something like that.
I think in most countries we see that a leading driver of support is whether the people see nuclear as low emissions or not. And I think the more that nuclear is built, and that it's talked about, and that news articles are shared saying it's net zero, it's going to help reduce emissions, that's the narrative that is needed to help get these people that are most climate concerned on board with supporting nuclear, in my mind. They'll be especially receptive to those messages, and the more that they see it, the more that they can get on board. So next, I want to go on to a separate set of slides looking at different energy attributes and how the public perceives those energy attributes for nuclear. So here we've got a rough heat map, and as you can see, reference to earlier, we've got Finland here and France, sort of slightly darker colours, Netherlands, Norway, all countries closer to Russia, self-sufficient, Sweden, who care more for self-sufficiency than where's Russia on this list than Russia, which is a lower shade of yellow. So yeah, a useful tool, and I think the other one that's occasionally useful is looking at all-in cost. This seems to be an especially large concern in Singapore, in Australia, in Finland, and in Germany. But I've often been surprised that all-in cost isn't a higher ranking attribute. What people time and time again across all countries this year and last year's survey say matters to them is safety of energy, regardless whether it's nuclear, just health and safety of any energy, reliability, and its ability to tackle climate change. If we dig into a few of these, so as mentioned before, emissions views on whether nuclear is low carbon or not are really important in driving support, and is upsetting to see for an energy that is zero emissions, it's not perceived that way. There's half in most countries, there's half the public that just does not see nuclear as zero emissions, as no carbon or even low carbon emissions. We put the low carbon in that, while nuclear doesn't have any direct emissions, some people will say take into account the indirect emissions of building the power plant or processing the uranium that goes into those, and therefore low carbon as far as life cycle emissions are concerned. Next, we've got the question on, do you consider building nuclear, solar, wind, these other energy options? Building more of those, are they going to reduce your bills or increase your bills? And then in these 5 countries, we see that there's more support for the idea that nuclear is going to reduce their bills than for solar, wind, biomass, or gas. And what's interesting, the other thing that links these five countries is they each saw a shutdown or reduction in the amount of nuclear generated in their country. So they've got burnt from that phase down of nuclear, and they've got that lived experience of that nuclear going. And that's
Rich,
driving them wanting more nuclear back.
is this a does this always have to be a case of you don't know what you got till it's gone? Or are there other countries outside of the ones that have recently shut down or phased out nuclear that also see nuclear as important for reducing electricity costs?
Yeah. So I'm quickly looking at my physical copy of the report. So other ones where nuclear is very well perceived relative to wind and solar are Poland, Finland, Sweden, or Sweden's on here, and Norway. So these, more Scandinavian countries. And that's interesting. I mean, Norway doesn't have any nuclear energy, but they're super excited by the prospect of nuclear being able to reduce their bills. And I think that maybe speaks to a cultural viewpoint on the importance of that security of a stable supply of energy.
Got it.
Right. And the final slide I wanted to show is on waste. And we asked the question to 31,000 respondents, are you concerned about your waste? On the left are those that are not concerned. On the right are the majority of people that are concerned. What's interesting to see is, there's no country where a majority is not concerned, but there's definitely a large variation amongst the countries. So the countries at the top are the ones where there's the most positive perception about nuclear waste. So if I go through them, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Netherlands, Egypt, Poland, Turkey. What's interesting with those is in Finland, they've got a deep geological repository. In Netherlands, they've got the Covra facility where waste is advertised to the world, to the public. And then in Turkey and Egypt, they're building their power plants at the moment. So they don't have any waste. Maybe that's why 10% of the public is not at all concerned. But it could be that the other reason is in these countries, the plan appears to be to ship the waste back to Russia once it's gone through the power plants. And then finally, the other option you have for what to do with your waste is recycle it. So who recycles it? We've got Russia, Japan, and France. And it's interesting to see that the countries where they recycle their waste, there's not a higher level of support for their waste management practices. It's really sort of the storing it deep underground, showing it off to the public, and shipping it back to where it comes from that appear to best align with public support for the waste.
Yeah, and I know it's, again, we're talking about data we can't see causation or dig into this any more than the data is allowing us. But one way to read this graph is the countries that have solutions or policies that people perceive as solutions to the waste have higher levels of support. But I think you could also read it in the reverse, and especially in light of what you just said about the recycling, that maybe these countries had a high level of support or higher level of support or comfortability with waste, and that allowed the ability to build the repository, to build the Cobra facility. Because I think of, in the US, a very famous example, Yucca Mountain, the announcement of a deep geological repository didn't calm anti-nuclear sentiment, and they didn't pack up and go home and say, okay, nuclear is good now. It actually really ignited it and threw additional fuel on the fire. So do you see it as being sort of a chicken and egg or self-reinforcing problem?
there'll be a bit of that chicken and egg. I mean, if we look at the top three countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, I think they're typically considered as high trust societies. So it could just be that that high trust in general society overlaps with high trust with, oh, my country is going to be able to look after its waste properly. So not necessarily something that the nuclear industry has done, right? But more a cultural thing. I think the way to tell is over the years, as more countries develop their equivalent of Cobra shipping it or storing it deep underground, as more deep geological repositories come online, to see what effect that has on public support. If suddenly a new deep geological repository comes online and support for waste goes up, that will be a fairly clear signal that's an effective way to reduce the public's concern. So time will tell.
Yeah.
Next set of slides is all around demographic splits in support. So here on the bottom x-axis, we see -50 to +100, and that's full support on the right side, and then more opposers than supporters on the left side. So across the 31,000 respondents, we see that amongst women, there's roughly as many women that support nuclear as oppose it, hence it comes out neutral on zero. Amongst those that are politically left-leaning, there's more opposers than supporters. And as you can see here, the most divided demographic attribute is this political leaning, left versus right. And I do think it's often overlooked as a important issue. Often, like, yeah, some of these other issues come front to mind, but actually that political leaning is really important. As mentioned earlier, you get political cycles. Some years, decades, it'll be left, some decades, it'll be right. And power plants last significantly longer than any political cycle. And therefore, if you want to be building a 10-year construction that will then operate for 60 years, you're going to want to make sure that your energy is supported by all political parties and all their voters to be able to pay off those many years of construction and maximize your revenue when operating. And I think it's quite telling that the countries with the largest political divides are the ones where there's nuclear fades out happening. So the large divides are in Taiwan, in Germany, in Spain, in Belgium, and their political leaning comes out on top. The other thing I thought was interesting was household income comes higher than I expected to see. So broadly, this is looking, obviously every country has different exchange rates, different purchasing power. So within each country, we look at what's the top third of earners and the bottom third of earners for low and high. And then right at the very bottom, apparently with very little impact on support, is parenthood. And I thought that was interesting too, that there's a line of reasoning that as parents have children under 18, there's suddenly a lot more safety concerns than when they don't have children, and that could lead them to be less supportive, but that's not what the data immediately suggests.
Couple of questions on this one, Rich. First off, political leaning, that's a pretty big divide. But I remember a few months ago when we were on talking about the US PACE report, that actually gender was the biggest divide that we saw in the United States. Is the US a total outlier country in terms of that dynamic, or are there other countries where there's a different divide larger than political leaning?
Yeah, so if we on the website, you'll be able to do this yourselves, but if we go into the UK, where I am, here we see gender is the biggest divide. Views on climate change, second biggest, age, and then only in fourth place is political alignment,
Wow.
which is actually fairly encouraging for the UK. The current Labour Party in power, their voters support nuclear more than they oppose. And then the two largest, second and third largest parties at the time of this polling have even higher levels of support. So that's quite encouraging for the UK. If we look in the US, I think it might actually not be gender top, but household income, which
Wow.
surprised me that in the US, it's high earners, men's Republicans, that are the most pro-nuclear. And that household income is really an important driver of support. If we look at, I think, Australia, here you can see what really large
Wow.
political divides can look like. Um, and broadly, the sort of concern for climate change, I expect there's a lot of mapping amongst those of the Liberal Party are not concerned, and those on the left parties are very concerned or fairly concerned.
It's also really interesting that, we surveyed 31, you know, different countries that have different political systems, different cultural values, but we're seeing generally that the left is opposed to nuclear and the right is pro-nuclear. Are there any countries where
We've
the left is pro-nuclear compared
so
to
so
the
here
right or
here
Mhm.
we've got a chart that sums that up. So on the bottom axis, we've got with all the G7 large G7 political parties ranked from far left to far right, and their level of support. So higher up is the more support, lower down is the more opposition. So you've got the German Greens with fairly low opposition, fairly high levels of opposition here, and then also in Germany the AfD very supportive of nuclear. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, there's this trend that the more right wing a voter is, the more that they appear to be in support of nuclear. The one clear outlier that we saw last year and this year in this regard is in South Africa, where it's actually the left leaning voters, and I think there's two left leaning parties there who are more supportive, and it's the right leaning party where the voters are more in opposition of nuclear. And speaking anecdotally to a someone that works in the nuclear industry in South Africa, she was telling me how the people that vote right more often live in Cape Town and they more often come from a European background.
Mm.
And that European background maybe aligns more with that sort of Greenpeace idealized version of environmentalism, which is anti-nuclear. But also those right-wing
Interesting.
voters are in Cape Town where they have the nuclear power plant just 10 miles out from their town. And maybe there's a bit of NIMBYism, being living in a big city close to a nuclear power plant.
Got it. Wow, so interesting.
The other thing I thought was interesting, which hopefully we'll be able to look at more in the future with more detail, is this idea. I, I'm not one for politics much, but there's the idea that left and right is more of a circle, a U-shaped politics or something. And in Germany, we sort of see this where as with most countries on the right, there's more support. But actually, as you go to the far left, support rebounds back up and is actually really in the left, center left sort of political mindset where there's the strongest opposition. So this will be an interesting dynamic to look at as the years go on.
Wow.
So yeah, here this is political parties and how large the divides are. So in Taiwan, we've got this large divide where the largest party is very much in support, and what's this? The third largest very much in opposition. The other big divides are in Germany, Italy, Japan, and Australia that we saw earlier. And then finally, we've got this view on what the level of support is amongst men and amongst women. And this year, so last year, there wasn't really any country where women had high levels of support. This year, that appears to have changed, and we've got in India, in Turkey, and Brazil, where women's support for nuclear is higher than for men. I'd say for India and Brazil is within the margin of error, but it's encouraging nonetheless that the levels of support are so close. Um, it's encouraging because it means that women would be as likely to join the nuclear workforce, and also encouraging that just higher leads to higher levels of overall support, the less divided your country is. So yeah, a few dynamics there.
Well, and it's interesting still, like the gender gap in China is not very large. It seems, I mean, that percentage is pretty high for women support of nuclear, which is also encouraging.
Mm.
Maybe
I-
especially given how much China is building, perhaps it's something that we can hope for that as we continue to, or as we start building, particularly in the West, we can see that rise in support and maybe close some of those really large gaps.
mm. Yeah, yeah. And I think, Russia here, oh, sorry, this is Poland, is a case where there's not much level of improvement left to be made amongst Polish men. So amongst Polish men, it'd be something like 75% are in support and 10% are in opposition. So it would take a lot more effort to get it further up. Whereas the low-hanging fruits, you could say, are amongst getting women to sort of think more about nuclear if you're looking to drive up support.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our main charts. You can also see them on our website here. And if you go to the bottom of our page, you're also able to take the quiz that we asked our 31,000 respondents. This doesn't get fed into our polling, but it is useful to us to understand the way that you look to answer questions, the way that you think about it, and also to track what our viewers think about nuclear energy. And then right at the bottom, you'll see a copy of our PDF report where there's many more charts and data tables where we have those 2 million data points, which you're more than encouraged to dig into and make your own conclusions, because I expect there's many interesting insights that we've yet to find. And yeah, it's a gold mine of data. So I'll open up to questions now.
Okay, let's see.
While Maddie, you read into the questions, I'll
Mhm.
explain that in our polling, there's the main set of questions that we ask year after year. And then every year we think of a new set of questions that we might ask to deep dive in a topic. So this year, the new questions included what a person's level of trust is in another country building its reactors. So what's interesting, America comes up as the most trusted partner to build nuclear in a person's home country for the majority of countries. And then obviously these things align very much geographically. But second, we were surprised to see Japan does fairly well in those rankings. It's second. And then in third and fourth place are Russia and China. Russia with a very good track record of exporting nuclear power plants. What was also interesting to see the UAE, South Korea, which is building in the UAE, didn't have that same high level of trust, even though they built a project in the UAE that by international standards was on time and on budget. That isn't recognized by the majority of the public, and that makes sense. The public doesn't follow nuclear news, let alone nuclear news in another country. And therefore, often this perception of trust in another country is formed by those geopolitical ties. The second question we asked this year was around understanding to what level do people understand nuclear? So last year we asked the question, how much do you think rates your own level of knowledge about nuclear energy? This year we also asked the question, this is a more academic question, what is the element that is the fuel to nuclear energy? Is it uranium? Is it carbon? Is it potassium? Is it something else? And what's the use in that is to be able to figure out, who has a false sense of confidence in their knowledge about nuclear, who doesn't know, yet they don't know that uranium is the fuel to nuclear. but also to what extent does knowing how nuclear works improve support? And there, the interesting dynamic we found was broadly in most countries amongst in the gender gap, men or right-leaning people or those not concerned about climate change, when they knew that uranium was the fuel to nuclear, their level of support went up very much. But for the opposing group, women, the left, those most concerned about climate change, it was the opposite. That when they knew that uranium was the fuel to nuclear, their level of support didn't necessarily go up, occasionally went down slightly. Which the conclusion there could be that knowledge about nuclear isn't the main driver. It correlates well with support, but it might not be the main driver, or at least not the main driver for all people. For the people that are already predisposed to liking nuclear, it might be a bigger driver, or it might just be that people know that uranium is the fuel to nuclear because they already support nuclear. So yeah, it was an interesting insight for the nuclear industry to reconsider its sort of full focus on knowledge education is key. Actually, there's softer topics that might be as important to driving support.
All right, Rich, some questions for you. Did the survey deal with land footprint at all or any other environmental attributes? The question is, how important is the land footprint of different clean energy options on support for nuclear?
So not directly. We don't ask that question. We do ask a sort of question about YIMBYism, where we ask, do you think having a nuclear plant, a wind farm, a solar farm built near your house is going to increase the value of your house or reduce the value of your house? And the conclusion there was that people don't really know what it's going to do to their house prices, and that actually very similar views on nuclear as with wind solar. For roughly 20% think it's going to go up, roughly 20% think it's going to go down, and that's the case in most countries. So that was fairly inconclusive as a question, but no direct questions on land footprint.
Though I will say, hey everybody, Mark Nelson here. One of the interesting things about a survey of this size and depth is that there's a bunch of things we haven't specifically turned into results in reports. So for example, Rich, you have data on whether your respondent is urban or rural, correct? What we can do is take a look at the urban or rural living and see how that changes, whether people seem to be valuing that aspect of, say, for example, wind. Norway is at this point a legendary anti-wind country. A lot of that is because people, even in the cities, are aware that they don't want to be near it outside of the city. I'm not saying that's a reason to build or not to build another thing, but that ends up being one of the arguments that can be brought up in Norway among people who have already decided that they care about apparently the land footprint of at least wind, because wind and solar are by definition not being built in cities, or if solar is being built in cities, it's not the large scale solar farm, which is one of the reasons we indicate that on this question survey. It's almost by definition something you would have to be thinking about or know about in order to ask. We could consider putting an explicit question in next year's survey. I will also say that because we ask all this year 30,000 respondents to write their thoughts on nuclear, some of them do indeed mention the small compact land footprint. Rich, I recall seeing a few of the quotes in there. We could go through and check that. But yeah, otherwise, great question. We've only begun scratching the surface of the insights that are here. Having seen that question, I think we can go back and see if we can find evidence one way or another for the compactness of nuclear mattering, or at least the lack of compactness of other energy sources mattering against them.
All right, we've got a comment here followed by a question about the greenhouse gas emissions. It's extraordinary the drivers for acceptance were concerns, specifically the misunderstanding of nuclear producing greenhouse gas in some countries. And a question that was asked is, what should students and nuclear professionals, or maybe youth advocates or the public in general, do to properly convey the idea that nuclear is essentially zero carbon, especially in countries where it would really benefit from the transition to nuclear to reduce their carbon and other air pollution?
Rich, if I may comment on this first. So
Yes.
I've seen critics of nuclear talking about being lower carbon than wind and solar. I've seen critics say, hey, it's so low that it doesn't matter. It's so much cleaner at that level. But I have to push back on that view and say, no, if coal is at 1,000, gas is at 400 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, wind being at 4, 5, or 6, it it does bear mentioning if nuclear is at 2, 3, and 4. In other words, nuclear can be several times cleaner than wind. Now, the view that it doesn't matter because it's all 2 orders of magnitude cleaner than coal, fine, that would be okay to dismiss this conversation about nuclear actually being slightly better if there wasn't an absolutely vast mass communication hole left by people not knowing that nuclear is clean at all. I think that even though I try to be very fair with complaints like that from people who work in other energy industries, I say when I give public conversations that nuclear is up to 10 times cleaner than solar, and it can be overlapping with or significantly cleaner than wind on a percentage or a relative basis, though it's a small range, much cleaner than gas and coal. The reason I point that out is because it's shocking enough to make it memorable that maybe people will take it away from their lecture. Otherwise, just saying it's all clean is not enough for me to be convinced that students would walk away or an audience would walk away and answer that question correctly in the survey. So it'll be interesting if anyone on this webinar goes and takes the survey. It will be good to compare those results to what we've seen from people who have not been on this webinar or have not been prompted by their love of nuclear power to log in and spend an hour of their time listening to detailed information about this. You'll be able to see the way we ask it, and you'll probably be able to share in our surprise that so few people seem to know that nuclear is not just low carbon or kind of clean, but it is literally lower carbon on life cycle emissions than competing clean energy, cooperating clean energy technologies.
I'd add that I'd
No,
add
go
that I
ahead,
think
Rich.
that people that oppose nuclear probably think of the negatives of nuclear front and foremost, whereas maybe you've no idea about the level of emissions for nuclear, but because you already support it, you consider it clean. So I think that what I mean to say is the more generally positive discourse about the low emissions, the high reliability, the low cost of nuclear, the generally more supportive nature of the public, and therefore they're probably more likely to consider it positive in other regards. So yeah, the vibes need to be right on nuclear.
Yes, agreed. Better vibes. Rich, you mentioned that women were overall neutral because the support was canceled out by opposition. And this is a really great question. Do you know if it was that there were two very polarized camps that ended up canceling each other out, or that there was a pretty even distribution across the spectrum for women? Like, what did that demographic distribution look like, if you know?
Yeah. So every country will be slightly different. I can't for sure remember, and therefore I do encourage. It's a great question. Do look it up in the data tables. My intuition, what I think I remember, is that men were more likely to have strong feelings of support or opposition than women. But the reason that women come out as more neutral is that they have high levels of tend to oppose nuclear. And that's what really brings down the score. Women also often have high levels of neither support nor oppose and don't know more neutral positions, which makes it harder for them to get sort of a high level of net support or low level of net support. But yeah, I think men are more strong in their opinions, is what my memory, what I can remember. But do look it up. Don't quote me on that.
I think this next question is probably best answered with some anecdata and some experience that Mark and Rich, you've both had. I noticed that the opposition to nuclear energy in Germany is less than it was several years ago before their nuclear shutdown. Is that only because the opposing groups won their fight, or is there some actual regret and anger about their shutdown?
Okay, so I just got back from Germany at 1 a.m. this morning, and I wasn't going out on the street to ask people about that, but I was working on the topic. The energy crisis happening at the same time as the celebration over the final nuclear plants meant that the two issues were very strongly tied together. The closure of the nuclear plants engendered probably the last major celebrations that the Green Party is ever going to have on the main topic that they were founded to work on, nuclear. It's not clear how there could be a big enough celebration or something to happen in nuclear to give them anything else to celebrate. So that was a sort of last gasp. Those celebrations were seen by the public, were well publicized, and happened at a time of backbreaking energy price increases. It also happened as the claimed solution for replacing the nuclear plants, natural gas from Russia, was falling into an absolute disastrous apparent defeat by history. So those things came together. It's also clear that there is quiet regret among some people kind of in the center, and there's also a radically surging right-wing party that is almost unanimously loud about nuclear and convinced that nuclear is good. It's likely that the fact that the right-wing party, which is feared and mistrusted by a lot of Germans, especially elites, the fact that they are so pro-nuclear has probably kept some of the center and center-left from expressing their own regret at the nuclear phase-out. It's assuredly stopped some actions that might have happened from happening because the anti-nuclear left-wing parties claim that to do anything about the perhaps mistaken nuclear phase-out is to give in to the right. So they've structured their arguments about government in such a way that because the right loves nuclear, they're excused from doing anything about the phase-out if anything could still be done. So complicated situation over there, but the energy crisis itself is absolutely the driving factor. And it's also that the center right and right in Germany was always pro-nuclear. It's just they had political leadership in Merkel who made the decision herself to end that, and people were stuck sort of grumbling and going along with it. And it wasn't obvious how much damage would be done to the economy until the phase outs were actually completed. Hopefully that answers your question.
Rich, I know you went over a graph that had the different energy attributes that were pulled, and it showed which were the most important to people for making their decisions. But do we have any insight into the people for whom are opposed or very opposed to nuclear, what their main factors for the opposition are? Or is it just sort of inferring based on some of those graphs, like the misunderstanding about emissions, etc.?
So we in the survey, we don't ask people, you've opposed nuclear. Of these 5 things, what's the key reason you've opposed? So there's 2 alternative ways that you can see this. Either in the written responses, where overwhelmingly people write the waste and safety. The other way is you use a Shapley regression model, which is less around what people say is the reason they've opposed, and more finding correlations in the data. See, does someone's concern about safety really lead to them being more in opposition? And what's interesting there is Shapley regression model suggests that actually waste and safety aren't number 1 in most countries. In the UK, for example, 80% of people are concerned about safety, but the majority of those people still support nuclear energy. And a Shapley regression model suggests that one of the bigger drivers for driving support is whether people see it as clean and whether they see nuclear as reliable.
Got it. Well, I think that wraps up the questions that we have in the queue. So I just want to reiterate our thanks to Anthropocene Institute for inviting us to talk to you about these results, also for being so generous and supporting this very important work, and Rich in particular for presenting this. Really interesting.
I look forward to and hope for many more years to come. Hopefully, more countries get involved, commission data for their country, and can help this project grow year after year.
Hear, hear.
All right. Thank you, everyone.